Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
We're most pleased to bring you a program today titled The Lewis Clark Expedition, a Bicentennial Celebration. This is airing here in 2005, and that's when Lewis and Clark made it to the West. And we're very fortunate to have a guest that's highly qualified to discuss this very exciting historical time that we had in our country. Our guest is John Krantz. He's a PBS producer in Idaho, and he was able to produce a wonderful film called Lewis and Clark Crossing the Centuries. Over 80 PBS stations have shown this particular production, including the ones that you're watching today. Also, he was the co-producer of Journey of Sacagawea, and that particular production won a number of awards, including the Emmy nomination for documentary and Cultural Historical National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, also a winner of the documentary The Telly Awards, and first place for Documentary Historical National Education Television Association. The second one, dealing with the Lewis and Clark Crossing the Centuries, is so recent it's not had time to receive awards, and I'm sure it will. John, thank you for being with us, and we have some segments to show on the program today, and you're very kind to be with us on this program, and congratulations on your productions.
Thank you. They were exciting to work on, a lot of work, but we think we came out with some pretty good programs.
You certainly did. That's testimony to the fact that PBS stations across America showed it, and we're happy to have our panel here. Janelle Burke, an attorney in the state of Idaho, and Erna Reinhardt, who is Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and we'll start the questioning with Janelle Burke.
Welcome to the show. It's been a great privilege to have you come because the work you've done has been very important and is very impressive. I've had the opportunity to view just a little bit of the clips ahead of the program, and our viewers are in for a treat a little later in the program. But my question in this first round has to do with the bicentennial. We've heard a lot about the bicentennial, and when exactly were those years that Lewis and Clark went on their expedition, and what are we talking about?
Well, the years that are referred to the most are 1804 to 1806, because that was when they left St. Louis and worked their way out to the coast and back to St. Louis. The round trip took place in those 2 years, although there were preparations before that, and certainly when we're talking about the bicentennial, there have been preparations for this 200th anniversary commemoration for years before this 2004 time period. When we talk about the bicentennial of Lewis and Clark in Idaho, they actually made it to what is now Idaho in 1805. They came across the Lemhi Pass, so the Idaho's 200th anniversary bicentennial is this year.
Thank you.
Erna Reinhardt.
Hi, John. Welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Tell us how long it took to make the video.
Well, it took several years actually, but most of the production was done in short windows, a week or 2 weeks at a time. We did a lot of traveling. We actually shot most of this footage ourselves. We went all the way to North Dakota. We went to the ocean. A lot of shooting in Idaho and Montana. We did aerials from a helicopter, and fortunately, when we produced the first program, The Journey of Sacagawea, we got footage that we can then use in the following program, Crossing the Centuries, so that we didn't have to start from scratch. But we had a lot of new interviews and a lot of new material, a lot of Native American perspectives in the Crossing the Centuries program, and the Sacagawea was focused solely on her. So we think we covered the whole gamut, but it was a couple years in the making for both of the programs, and actually this is the third. We did one about 10 years ago, Lewis and Clark in Idaho, and so we've been doing Lewis and Clark stuff for a while.
How would you, as a television producer, how do you go about doing that research? Do you work side by side with a historian that helps you, or do you guys do the research yourselves?
Well, we do a lot of the research, but certainly we rely on historians and experts and whatever. We worked with the Idaho Historical Society on some of the research and the script. In fact, we had historical consultants, and usually do on anything larger. We have people that look at the script and give us ideas of where to go and do research. And then, of course, the people that we interview for the program, we were fortunate in Crossing the Centuries. We got two of the foremost Lewis and Clark experts in the country with James Rhonda and Gary Moulton. We were just real lucky to get them. And then a whole range of other folks, a lot of Native Americans who have a whole different story to tell and a different perspective. And we had the the chair of the Montana Historical Society in that program. We were fortunate to get a lot of experts on Lewis and Clark from both the white society and Native American.
And tell us, this is my last question, tell us where does the program begin in time and where does it end?
Well, it pretty much begins running up to the expedition leaving. We talk a little bit about the setup with the Louisiana Purchase and the whole impetus, but the expedition's start was constructed before the Louisiana Purchase happened. So we start kind of at that juncture of they're preparing for the expedition, and then the Louisiana Purchase happens, which emphasizes the mission of the journey even more. So pretty much around that 1804 time period, and then it takes them to the coast and back. So it is that 1804 to 1806 time period that we cover more of the journey out, because that's the most dramatic part, although there were some dramatic things on the return journey too.
Great.
I admire anyone like yourself who's not only a great artist, but commitment to stay with the project so long. And before we show the first clip, my question is, you really absorbed yourself in this process. What makes this particular historical event so fascinating to Americans and even other countries? Why is Lewis and Clark's trip so fascinating, and what significant role did it play in our history?
Well, there's a lot of people that have different opinions on that, and it's just one of the compelling reasons for Lewis and Clark is kind of a national story, because the preparations actually start with Thomas Jefferson in Washington, and they work their way with the pre-supply period from the East Coast all the way to St. Louis, and then they work their way from St. Louis to the coast and back. So everybody who lives in this country has been touched in some way by Lewis and Clark, and it was really the beginning of this coast to coast, this sea to sea country, and that is fascinating for people. And just the whole adventure about going into this unknown country to them.
And without this expedition at this time, so much was learned about the development. Would the development of the West and actually the expansion of the United States into new states been much more delayed if it had not been for this trip?
Certainly it would have been delayed, no question. If Lewis and Clark wouldn't have returned for some reason, people say maybe 50, 60, 70 years, it would have set back the progress of settling the West. But when Lewis and Clark did make the journey and did return, it kind of opened up the West. It was the beginning of the westward migration when they saw that Lewis and Clark made it and knew what was out there and knew how to travel.
History might even been different. Of 50 or 60 years, some others might have explored their other countries. We might be different today. With that, I'm going to ask our wonderful staff to put up the Lewis and Clark Crossing the Centuries. We have about a little over a minute to show our viewers what this film is all about. If they'll do that at this time, please.
This is one of the emblematic American stories. Every nation has foundation myths. This is our American Odyssey.
The journey of Lewis and Clark has captured the imagination of millions and cemented its place in the soul of the nation.
It's a story of cooperation and friendship. It's a story of great leadership by the two captains. And I think those stories always speak to people.
The Lewis and Clark expedition marked the beginning of 2 centuries of exploration and change for a young United States. For Native Americans, the change would be tragic.
They made the Western world very much aware of our environment. And so in that respects, that was devastation to us. And it became what you would call a bittersweet history.
And yet, it was only with the help of tribes like the Shoshone, the Nez Perce, the Mandan, and others, that the Corps of Discovery was able to cross the continent. Today, as we observe the journey's bicentennial, these native contributions are being more fully recognized.
I hope that out of that both Indian people and non-Indian people will recognize the importance of both groups and what both groups have, and that we have to go on from here.
Cooperation between cultures has become a central theme of this bicentennial. an ideal that crosses the centuries and comes alive for those who commemorate the journey of Lewis and Clark.
That was an amazing segment from your production. In my view, it's just a matter of time. Do you have awards for that particular production? Before we go to another segment we have on your other film that you co-produced, one thing comes to my mind almost immediately is that there was such risk in doing this. What did you learn about how close did they come of not surviving, and are there challenges that are similar to those that we face today, or even more difficult then?
Well, they did come very close to not making it. They had a major encounter early in the journey with the Teton Sioux, and the Teton Sioux vastly outnumbered the expedition and really didn't want them going upriver because they controlled the river. But they managed to get through that. They managed to get through the really tough snows over the Bitterroots, and they had many incidents where they might not have survived. It was miraculous. They only lost one man from an appendicitis that probably couldn't have been cured today. But they learned perseverance. Working on this program, I learned, we had some challenges too, and I just kept saying, if Lewis and Clark can persevere through all of these challenges, I think that's what they can teach us today, is perseverance and having a goal. They just continued on despite the obstacles that were placed in their path, and they just overcame, and they did it.
Refused to be defeatist.
Right.
On the second segment, it's dealing with the journey of Sacagawea, and you're the co-producer. We'll ask our staff to put that up now, and then we'll talk a little bit about it also.
Many mysteries surround her. More mountains, lakes, and streams bear her name than any other North American woman. Across the nation, statues have been erected in honor of her memory.
I think she exemplifies that strength, that resilience of what it is to be a woman.
I think she has a very beautiful place in all of our hearts, and I hope that people realize, that women are much stronger than men give them credit for. And this young woman was definitely more than a pioneer. She was a leader in so many ways.
Again, just incredible dramatic production. Congratulations to you. It's extremely powerful. I'll yield back to the panel, and in my next turn we may ask some more about this particular film. Janelle Burke.
Well, I want to congratulate you on those beautiful scenes. The scenery was just gorgeous, both in the Sacagawea film and also the camas fields. I take it those were camas fields. Yeah. In the first clip, it was just, they were beautiful. The blue-purple blooms.
It's gorgeous up there. That was actually at the dedication of the new Forest Service Visitor Center at the Montana-Idaho border, and there were a lot of folks there, and the Nez Perce came there, and those were the Nez Perce riders that were going through those fields in their traditional route that actually Lewis and Clark followed, the Nez Perce route through those mountains.
It was gorgeous. Now that leads right into my next question. I know there's some families out there that are planning their events for 2005, and they're going to want to know, what can we do this year to know more about Lewis and Clark? And so what would you suggest? What are some books or some films or some trips or some programs that they might attend?
Well, there are a lot of things you can do with Lewis and Clark. The information's out there, and we have a website. Lots of folks have websites that they could go to start. There's James Ronda's book, Among the Indians. There's Moulton's diaries that he's edited the diaries, the most recent version. There's 20 volumes of that. But physically on the ground, you can follow a lot of the trail. In fact, you can follow a lot of the trail in an automobile. If you just wanted to do the Montana-Idaho section, you could find one of these books. I don't have the name off the top of my head, but it follows the route tells you significant features along the route, and you can drive. You can come over Lemhi Pass in an automobile where Lewis and Clark came over. You can go to the town of Salmon. There's a Sacagawea Center newly dedicated in Salmon. Then you can follow from there up toward that visitor center that's on the Montana, through the Bitterroot Valley to the Montana-Idaho border, come down Highway 12 that parallels the route up in the mountains that Lewis and Clark took. Stop in Lewiston. They have a symposium and a Lewis and Clark festival and fair in Lewiston every summer. And this being the actual 200th in Idaho, that will be big in Lewiston this year. And they'll probably have a big festival in Salmon too. So those two towns will have some gatherings. And then you can continue all the way along the Columbia Gorge out to the coast, and there's the Fort Clatsop out on the coast and some visitor centers out there that are wonderful. So you could do any amount of Lewis and Clark exploring and driving to follow up on your reading of the books and looking at the internet site. So and there's lots of things you can do.
Can you give us that website for you?
It's idahoptv.org, and we have a pretty extensive Lewis and Clark website now that we've done actually 4 kind of productions. We did the one 10 years ago and these 2, and then we have another one that's 60-second clips just from the journal. We did 36 of those with some of the footage that we acquired or worked with other stations and producers to get.
Thank you.
Reinhardt.
John, one of the things that I think was an outcome of all of these, projects was I believe it's a DVD or a video that got sent to all the 5th grade classrooms in the state of Idaho. Tell us about that.
Well, I think we did that with the Journey of Sacagawea, and we also did that with Lewis and Clark Moments in Time. We just think that, especially since this story is so central to Idaho. I mean, Idaho is in the heart of this story. It's where they had some of their most difficult encounters. They met the 2 really important tribes to Lewis and Clark, the Lemhi Shoshone and the Nez Perce. And so we thought, if we're going to do this production, and Lewis and Clark is taught in the classrooms, why not send the Sacagawea video out? And then we also sent out the DVD that has those Lewis and Clark moments, the actual entries from the Lewis and Clark journals, the 2 video that we have acquired for the other programs. So,
excellent.
I want to take advantage of your knowledge and in your research on this. We've heard so much about this remarkable lady, Sacagawea, and she was on the trip, and like the other film we talk about, there's historical disagreements on what all happened. From your research, and in the clip it also indicated that remarkably she has more geographical locations named for her than any other woman in the history of North America. What did you learn about her that was so significant to this expedition?
Well, it's actually pretty incredible. You have to think about the time frame that you're in. You're in the early 1800s.
Right.
This is the only woman on the expedition. She has a child, a young baby, and she's traveling and enduring all these hardships that the men are with the child. And you know, basically she's a slave, more or less. She's the wife of Charbonneau, but the way that French fur traders took Native American wives, they didn't have many rights. But she still, because of her knowledge and her perseverance, she elevated her status from a Native American woman to an equal member of that expedition by the time that they made it to the coast, because of all her contributions with her geographical knowledge, her knowledge of plants, especially her relationship with the Lemhi Shoshone, because when they reached what is now Idaho, if they wouldn't have gotten horses from the Lemhi Shoshone, they had been in boats that whole time up to the ever-narrowing waters of the tributaries of the Missouri. They were out of luck. They had boats couldn't go any further. Her relationship with Chief Kameawet, her brother, got them the horses that allowed them to go on, and she elevated her status, and she was able to vote when they got to the coast on the location for the winter camp. Her and York, a Native American and a black man, voting in 1805.
Very significant. If she had not been on the trip and they'd not had the relationship she had and they'd not had the horses, would the expedition have stopped there and maybe gone back?
Journal entries actually indicate that Lewis is so worried about finding horses, and he has some entries that say, well, if we don't find horses, I'm afraid our whole journey is in vain. We're going to have to possibly turn back, because there's no way, when they find out that there's not a river to go down on the other side, that there's no way to continue if they don't have horses.
Unlike today, when we have satellites and we can beam over all areas, how did she have such a knowledge of that whole trip without visiting that area before?
Well, you know, that whole thing about her knowing the geography in the program, Native Americans, that was part of their culture, to learn the geography. And even though she was abducted at a very young age and taken from what is now Idaho back to North Dakota with the Mandans, it was about 5 or 6 years later that then she came back toward her country, and she remembered the landmarks.
So she had traveled much of, not all of it, but she had traveled significant portions.
She knew the Idaho country. And when they started approaching the Idaho-Montana country, Three Forks is the area that she started to recognize, and from then on, she could tell the expedition what was coming up, and it was pretty amazing.
Remarkable.
Her knowledge.
Janelle Burke.
Lewis and Clark are two names that are intertwined in history. Can you tell us what the gentlemen were like? How were they different? I think they were very different in some respects. How would you describe them?
Well, they were quite different, but they made a great team, obviously. Well, Lewis and Clark. Lewis was the kind of the dreamer, the excited one, and you know, he had the mood swings and everything, but he really had a lot of fortitude. Clark was more practical. He was the map maker. He was the down-to-earth guy, and you may know what happened in later life with Lewis and Clark. Lewis is the one that couldn't adapt to life after the expedition, and they think he took his life later. Clark had a long life, was a successful governor in the Missouri Territory, and but together on that trip, they were just a perfect team because they balanced each other out with the kind of the one practical side and the one a little bit more of a dreamer side.
The adventure.
Yeah.
Now, you must have had, as you were doing these two documentaries, sometimes when your hair just stood on end thinking, this is so phenomenal. Can you give us some examples of that when you just thought, how could this happen? It was miraculous.
What's really neat is there are places still on the Lewis and Clark Trail, the route that they followed, that you can still imagine what it was like because the geography is still the same. When we were on the Missouri River in northwest Montana, that area hasn't changed much. Even up on the Lemhi Pass, where they came into what is now Idaho, you can stand there and you can see the view of the mountains where Lewis looked across and said, there's no Columbia River here. Look at these mountains, endless mountains that we have to cross now. And you can get the feeling of, and up on the Lolo Trail where they came through the Bitterroots, that's not very developed. And so it's those times when you're on those undeveloped parts of the country that you see what maybe they saw, that you feel a kinship to their experiences, and that's pretty interesting.
They were out there all alone.
Yes, alone except for the times that they ran into the Native Americans. And the Native Americans is something that we emphasized in obviously both of these. One program was totally focusing on Sacagawea, and the other we talked about the tribes that helped them all the way along the way, the Mandan, the Lemhi Shoshone, the Nez Perce, the Chinook on the coast. Tribes helped them the whole way, but there were plenty of times through Montana where they didn't see any Native Americans. They didn't know exactly what was there, and they were on their own. But when they had help from the Native Americans, they appreciated it, and most of the time the relations were friendly and helpful. There were times when they weren't, but for the most part, it was a good relationship between Lewis and Clark and the Native Americans, and we try to bring out that in the program.
John, in your program, is this the first time, and maybe you don't know the answer to this, but is this the first time that there's been a program like this about Lewis and Clark where the Native American perspective has been included?
I think this one, I haven't seen a lot that have emphasized the Native Americans as much as this, and that was kind of by design that we decided to go this route, because there have been a lot of, obviously Ken Burns did the definitive Lewis and Clark documentary on pretty much their journey. So we thought to add to the educational experience, we should bring a different perspective, maybe a broader perspective, because that's all the historians are talking about. We know everything from the journals, but the thing that needs to be added to the view is the Native American perspective, and that they will bring a new perspective to this story that's been told and retold for decades. But I think this has the most Native American perspective that I know of in a Lewis and Clark program. so far.
And tell us some of the different tribes that you included in the program.
Well, we included most of the major tribes. We included members of the Mandan Hidatsa, where they spent their first winter. We included members of the Salish tribe that used to live in the Bitterroot Valley, where they came through. The Lemhi Shoshone, obviously, were before that when they first came into Idaho. The Lemhi Shoshone lived in the Salmon area of Idaho. Then the Salish were up in the Bitterroot Valley. Then they came across to the Nez Perce country, and we talked to many Nez Perce. And then there were tribes in the Columbia River Basin. We talked to some representative of the Columbia River tribes, and then the Chinook, where they wintered on that second winter. So we have multiple tribal members from those major tribes that they encountered.
Great.
I'm just fascinated with this whole process, and you're so informed. It's too bad that we don't have a couple hours. As you studied this very, very dangerous trip, what is the most great crisis? At what point did it most come close to failing, or for they to lose their lives?
Well, there were probably two, is what the experts point to. And the one was the one I referred to earlier, early in the trip in the Teton, Lakota area, near what is now Pierre, North Dakota. They just encountered the tribe that controlled the river, and they wanted to bargain with them with goods, and they gave them some goods, but it wasn't what the Sioux were used to. There had been traders coming up the river, and they wanted more. And they saw all these men, and they didn't want to cede control of the river. So there was a real standoff for 3 days, and that was a very crisis point where it almost came to arms. They actually drew a sword, cocked their rifles, and the Native Americans had their bows with 200 warriors ready to fight. And somehow, between the chiefs and Lewis and Clark, the captains, they said, this isn't going to be good for either of us. And they backed down. And it wasn't so much of a back down as a cooling off. They said, okay. So they survived that crisis. The other most perilous crisis where they were close to death was right here in Idaho, over the Bitterroots, where they were late in the year, and they ran into an early snowstorm and almost perished there.
On that note, we have to bring the program conclusion. John Krantz, thank you so much, and congratulations on again capturing such important historical events. And we know that you enjoyed doing that. We very much appreciate your being on this program. We also, again, congratulate you and the others involved in the productions on being recognized for such outstanding work. And PBS stations around America are so fortunate that they bring such quality programs. PBS is great for this country. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, we would invite you to be with us again next week at the same time, and we'll discuss another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.